Welcome back to the Jove Ditch Your Dorm podcast. My name is Alex with Jove. Today, I have a special guest with us, a private landlord, Qadim Ghani. Qadim, it's nice to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here. When we were getting prepped for the show, you told me about your experience and how you actually became a landlord, starting off with Temple and then Drexel. Would you mind sharing that experience with everyone here?
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. Thank you so much for having me on. My experience, I came to Philadelphia in 2003 and did the dorm thing for a little while. And a couple of my friends and I realized we'd probably be better off a little bit more space and a little bit more freedom if we got a place of our own close to campus, and kind of became enamored with the idea of passive income and just rental property in general. We knew what we were paying in rent. And, we were young teenagers at the time, so we explored the mail of our landlord one day and realized what he was paying for a mortgage and what we were paying in rent. We quickly did the math and said, hey, this is some pretty good business to get into. So from that point onward, I knew I would have a 9-to-5 and W-2 income, but I always knew I wanted to get into rental properties and passive income. And flash forward a little bit, I started with Drexel University a little after undergraduate, and they ran an amazing program over there. I actually built the program. It's the Drexel Home Purchase Assistance Program, and they'll give you $15,000 towards the purchase of a home within their defined geographic boundaries. And at the time, the city would match that with $4,000 of their own. So I was actually able to get $19,000 towards the purchase of my first home, which was in University City. And it was 3,000 square foot, 4-bedroom place. A lot of the rules around getting those grants were that I had to own or occupy for 5 years, which I did up to 2017, at which point I moved out and I started renting to a mix of UPenn students, Drexel students, and young professionals who were also pursuing their master's degrees at each of those institutions.
That sounds like a great move. Is the city still offering something like that, or is that long past?
So the funding dried up, and I really wouldn't be able to tell you how it exists. I know they brought it back. It didn't exist in the same capacity. There became income guidelines on the program later on, but it was one of those things where the city wanted to kind of invest in stabilizing the tax base for certain areas. So they wanted to incentivize a lot of folks to kind of buy in these more developing areas, knowing that they would have the tax abatement. The future of the city would be a little bit more stable once the abatement expires. So I know the abatements are changing drastically once we get to 2021. So I'd imagine they probably trim the program or change the program, the matching grant a little bit. But a lot of partner organizations, one of the stipulations is that your organization that you work for has to kick in some money, and then the city will then match a portion of that money up to about $4,000. I think they had 15 participating organizations at the time, and I can look up the website for you and kick it over to you. I can't call it off the top of my head right now.
No, that's great. I think that's really interesting information, and it's interesting that you in that time were so industrious to start thinking about, hey, we opened up a piece of mail from our landlord, and this isn't a bad gig. Maybe we should get into it ourselves. Very cool.
Alex, you call it industrious. The state of Pennsylvania calls it illegal. So I appreciate you putting your spin on that. But yeah, no, it was a good move on our part, and really happy that we did do that.
Awesome. And so now this property that you have, you rent it out to UPenn and Drexel students. I understand you also have a second property.
That's right. I have a property in Fairmount, actually really close to where I lived when I was a Temple student. The neighborhood has changed drastically for the better. So at the time that I bought it in 2018, it was brand new construction. No one had ever lived in it. And I've been renting out to very similar demographics, but instead of Penn and Drexel students, primarily Temple graduate students or Temple dentistry students. So that's kind of the mix that I have in there right now.
Got it. A lot of the watchers of our podcast are Temple, Drexel, and UPenn students, and a lot of them are in their freshman year or sophomore year in college. They're used to living in the dorms, then they're looking for something for next year to rent with either by themselves or with some roommates. And so we wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what type of things should a student who's looking to move into their first apartment outside of a dorm be looking at when they're choosing an apartment that they're going to live in for next year?
The first thing that comes to my mind is cost. So I think a lot of people right away will look at the sticker price. The average rent for my tenants is about $750 to $760, and that's average. And the market will command different things depending on what school you're looking at, if you're in the city, outside of the city. So cost is going to look significantly cheaper. If you measure $750 against Drexel's room and board, at last I checked, it was about $14,000. You'll say right away, wow, this is a significant savings. But the other piece of that is you have to factor in what the board piece of it is going to cost you. So if you can, for a net zero model in what I charge, you'd be $750 on rent. And if you can basically make $400 a month work for your food, then you'll net zero. If you're a cooker or you're, just a person who's very judicious about how they spend money on food, then you're actually going to make out a little bit better. So I'd say that's one of the first things that you want to evaluate. And then the other thing is your capacity to live in spaces and places that aren't designed for students. So and what I mean by that is if you're not used to an urban setting, it could be very intimidating from you. If you're from wide open land and everything like that, then you get to a college campus, that's one universe. It's very encapsulated, and you don't have to worry about some of the things that go on in the city. And you can always call campus police if someone's being too noisy or if things are not going to your liking. So once you move into the city, you're really at the mercy of the city at that point. So if it's not an environment that you're accustomed to or comfortable in, those are things you're going to want to weigh, whether or not you can walk around and potentially feel safe. And, obviously between the finance and the safety, I think if you're able to manage those two pieces of it, those are the things that come to my mind, first of all. Those are usually the questions that I get from folks.
Got it. In terms of finances, what should students consider as what will be their upfront payment when choosing an apartment? So, example, they pick in the apartment that they want to live in. What kind of budget should they have saved up, either from them or ask for assistance from their parents and be ready to put down?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's typically first, last, and security deposit.
Qadim, for some reason, your mic muted.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. There you go. Go ahead and if you can restart that sentence.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so based on the example that I gave earlier, first, last, and security deposit is what I ask for. I think that's pretty standard across the industry. So I'd say what you want to have saved up is somewhere between $2,100 and $2,500. And I think there's a lot of flexibility in those numbers. So basically what a landlord wants to do is be able to have some peace of mind, especially if you're working with someone who's younger and their income is either non-existent or coming from their parents or a loan or something like that. So you need to give that landlord a peace of mind. So I've had a lot of unique situations where people ask me, can I be flexible? So instead of it being first, last, and security, they've asked, can we do first month, second month, and security? And what that does is that gives them some cash flow relief, because they're going to shell out, $2,100, and then they can breathe easy because they know that they can kind of accumulate some money for the next 2 months before they have a rental payment due. So from my perspective, that's still the same net amount of money. So it made me feel very comfortable. I was happy to do that with them. Another thing I think a lot of landlords will be amicable to is if you're able to pay 6 months up front. So a lot of times you'll see students get a refund check and they say, hey, listen, I don't have significant credit and I don't have a traditional income, but I do have substantial cash assets up front. Would you be willing to A, give me a rental discount, or B, consider me without my significant credit history because of the fact that I have such sizable upfront cash? To a landlord, that type of thing is gold. Especially to a private landlord, someone who's a little bit more flexible, that person would probably jump on that right away. That's a situation in which you're telling me you're going to give me half a year of our contract up front. I get that money right away, and I get to sit on that. I get to invest it. I get to do whatever I want. And I also have peace of mind. I know you're a tenant who's already paid through the month of December. So you can kind of, if you're able to do that, I don't want to say you can call your own shots, but you're really moving from a point, you're negotiating from a point of power at that stance. So especially if you're competing with other applicants, if it's a really desirable place, if Alex and I are competing for the same spot and Alex is able to put down 6 months right away, and I'm struggling to come up with first, last, and security, in the eyes of a landlord, Alex is the much more worthy applicant at that point.
That's a really great point, and I think that's something that students are not thinking about up front, is that they have the ability to make offers, make suggestions, and find some ground where they can work with the landlord. And I would imagine, as you mentioned, that this will usually work with individual landlords. I'm assuming that you mean that with large apartment complexes, something like this probably is not an option.
Yeah, and I don't own a larger complex, but I've been on both sides of this, and I've worked with individual landlords as well as bigger buildings, and the negotiation factor just isn't there. So they're managing to a bottom line, and they've baked in a margin of error. They've baked in some vacancy factor. So from their perspective, they have an infrastructure built where they can advertise and afford to have places vacant for a little while. They don't have to negotiate on their number. So I think generally you'll see more wiggle room with a one-to-one person than you will with the property management companies managing bigger properties.
Got it. That makes sense. And for someone who's listening to this and is completely green to the concept of what a security deposit is, how would you define security deposit?
Somewhat multifaceted. As I said, you want to give the landlord a sense of comfort. And I think that's what the security deposit does. It's effectively, they make that security deposit match what your rental payment is. In most cases, sometimes you'll see another number, and it's usually arbitrary, but it's basically to say, okay, if I'm renting to Alex and he misses a month of payment, I know that I have that security deposit so that I'm not taking a loss for that month. In addition to that, even if Alex paid his rent on time every single month, and he was a guy who liked to entertain a lot and damage the property, once he moved out, I could use that security deposit to offset the cost of renovating the place if I needed to do major repairs. So, if you're starting from scratch, that security deposit can generally trip you up. But I'd say to your listeners, it's also your money. And for all intents and purposes, you want to do everything that you can to get that money back. Make sure you're paying your rent on time, because a lot of leases will structure in a late payment penalty, which you won't know until you get your security deposit back and they itemize the fact that you were late in January, March, and September. And take good care of the property. Obviously, that one kind of goes without saying. But if you get a landlord who might nickel and dime you, that could really add up. If you broke a handle, things that are natural wear and tear, sometimes they could really hold against you. So do what you can to make sure you get your money back from those landlords. And the other part that I want to kind of let your listeners know about is, if you do submit a security deposit, most of the time that security deposit is refundable within net 90 days. That means if you finish your lease on December 31st, the landlord doesn't really have to give you back your security deposit until April 1st. So you could be without that cash for 90 days, and you may have been banking on getting that money back to take care of your rent at the next place or to take care of other expenses. So just be mindful that they do hold that money for a little while. They're generally legally able to do that the way most leases are structured. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with security deposit.
Got it. And you bring up a very good point as well, is make sure you read your leases and all of the clauses that are in there, because it is a legal document that you are signing that you will be bound to. And if you have questions, you should be able to ask your landlord those questions, and you'll get a sense right off the bat if they're not willing to work with you on those questions or even entertain you asking them. You'll get a sense of the type of relationship that you'll have with your landlord moving forward, which is where I think it's a lot more flexible having a relationship with a independent landlord as opposed to a large apartment complexes. There's pros and cons for both, but flexibility definitely tends to the side of the independent landlord. Qadim, my next question is, in terms of the length of the lease, how long is the typical lease, and is there any variation from that standard length for students to consider?
It's a really good question. And not only is there, so it's usually a year-long lease. It's usually 12 months. A lot of landlords, the process of finding new tenants is difficult, and it can be expensive at times. You're also showing the property to multiple people, so it can be very time-consuming. And you really don't want the place turning over that often from a landlord perspective. So if you were going to Airbnb a place, especially in the time of Corona, you're going to need to sterilize that place, get a professional cleaner in there. There's more opportunities. You may have to change lock codes on a regular basis. So a lot of landlords will favor a 12-month lease, and a lot of landlords will really like to lease, particularly in areas around colleges and universities. They like to lease with a July 1, August 1, or September 1 start date. You won't see a lot of people out there trying to do a November 1 start date. Reason being is everyone's turning over around the summer. A lot of people will leave for the summer. And there's generally not a lot of flexibility there. You might be able to catch a landlord who's and will give you a lease that kind of fits your terms. But across the board, I'd say it's more natural to see a 12-month. And you're seeing the market move towards subletters, because we talked about the summer months. A lot of people aren't in school. Drexel may be an exception to that, but the summer months, if you go back to your hometown or you don't get a job locally or you want to go down to the beach for the entire summer, I allow for sublets. But in my case, my renter who I signed the lease with is the one that's still on the hook for everything. So there's got to be a secondary agreement between my tenant and their subletter. And that agreement I have nothing to do with. The tenant is still the person that I'm holding accountable.
Got it. And that's a great point. So if you are considering doing a sublet and your landlord has approved it, you should still understand the terms of that you will probably, in most cases, still be bound to whatever that subletter does in the apartment. If they damage the place, you should have an agreement with them that will bind that person, that subletter, to you for any damages that you are now responsible for based on your original agreement with your landlord. And speaking of terms and length, how far in advance should a student start looking for a property for the next year? Let's assume that we're in this year, we're looking for an apartment that's going to start in fall semester 2021. How long before August 1st or August 30th, when I move in, should I be looking?
You'll ramp it up gradually over time, but I'd say probably about 2 months out. And then you can still find yourself some very nice places. I mean, I was down to the last week with my last group of tenants that moved in. And one of the guys actually asked if we could accelerate it because if he couldn't move in a day early, he would have been homeless for a night. So you can wait and get down to the wire and still find some very good things, but I don't think anyone wants that stress in their life. So I think if you start 2 months out, and realistically, once you get to about the 6-week mark, a lot of the landlords write into their contract that the tenants have to notify you 60 days out if they're going to renew or not renew. And at that point, if you decide to not renew, the landlord should start aggressively marketing. So you'll see a lot of places come on the market about 60 days before they're going to be, vacant. So I think that that's the sweet spot right in there is 2 months. And then, between weeks, probably 3 to 6, that's when you're really, really aggressive. If you start to get to week 2 before you're ready to move, you should probably allocate a lot of time to that. You should probably try to make that one your full-time job at that point because you're really in crunch time at that point.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. When looking for roommates, I'm sure you've seen some very great stories and friendships come out of this, and I'm sure you've seen some horror stories and tearful situations happen from this. What advice would you have for students that are selecting their roommates and the people that they're going to be living with for the next at minimum 12 months?
It's really interesting because I've met people who were the best of friends, the absolute best of friends, and they were going to move in together and they're going to be friends forever. And they move in together and about 4 months into it, it really sours the relationship. Living with someone is a different universe. And on the other side of that, I've seen people who found each other on Facebook 2 weeks ago and said, hey, I'm moving to Philadelphia. You moving to Philadelphia? And they link up. They maybe have a drink once before they actually move in together. And those relationships work out famously. So I'd say when you're doing this, it's not a great exercise to interview people that you're going to necessarily live with. But at the same time, like you do want to kind of interview, ask those questions that are going to be immediately relevant to you. What type of hours do you keep? Are you personal about your space? Are you loud? Do you play your music loud? Like things that are going to impact you adversely. Those are the questions that you want to ask as well. And I'd say also be mindful that once you start sharing space, some of the things that you used to do, you should be considerate. So it's always tricky trying to figure out what that fit is going to be. But I'd say one of the big things, especially among people who are trying to find roommate fits, make sure you go meet the landlord together. Make sure you take a look at the property together. Because if Alex and I are trying to move in together, what's important to me, I'm going to ask those questions. But I'm not necessarily going to ask the questions that are representative of Alex's interests. So we want to be there together. We want to make sure we're asking the right questions, because if I don't do that on the front end and Alex moves in and then realizes there's all these rules that are somehow stifling what he wants to do, there's going to be some friction that comes as a degree of that. So I think it's a great idea for you to sit down with your potential roommates and say, listen, this is me in a nutshell. Tell me about you. Tell me the good, the bad, the ugly, and then make a decision on if you can live with some of those things. And then go do the same thing with your landlord. Sit down with them and talk to them. And, you can get a good feel from someone probably within 10 minutes of meeting them if they're going to be engaged with you, what type of landlord they're going to be. I think it's very easy to read a lot of folks, particularly in instances where you're dealing with the actual owner of the property.
Great advice. In terms of making payments on a monthly basis for rent, how is that usually done in the apartments that you keep?
Exclusively through Venmo, which makes life very, very easy. I remember when I was renting, it used to have to be a check. And I mean, if you have 4 people, none of us had the cash to cover the rent. So basically, like if me and 3 of my buddies live together and I'm writing a check to the landlord, I had to collect their payments a week in advance so that I could deposit into my bank account so that I could write a check that wouldn't bounce to the landlord. That's no longer the situation, and I think most places will take electronic. I know owners who are face-to-face, smaller single-unit dwellings, such as myself, love Venmo. It's very easy. It's obviously paperless, and the money ends up in your account a lot faster. I think generally everyone finds it easier. And, I get to a point where I just, if someone forgets, I've never enforced a late fee a day in my life for any of my tenants. But if someone forgets and we get to like the 9th of the month, I just bill them via Venmo, and they send it right over, and you see a text message, Qadim, I'm sorry, it slipped my mind, it's midterms, it's finals, won't happen again. And, it's so easy, and it takes the awkwardness out of everything. If you miss a payment or something's running late, or, you don't want to have to chase people down for rent. They don't want to have to, see you every month to give you a check. No one wants to coordinate that. That's annoying. So I think if you ask those questions up front, your landlord will be very amicable to it. I think virtually everyone uses some form of either Venmo, PayPal, Zelle, some sort of cash management tool, cash management app.
Great. Well, I think you've shared a lot of great insights. I hope who's ever watching has heard them loud and clear. Qadim, what is one of the top takeaways from everything that you've shared that you would really stress onto freshmen and sophomores that are looking for a new apartment to consider?
Yeah, your relationship with your landlord is very interesting. If all goes according to plan, you should never have to deal with that person. And I think everyone would almost prefer it that way. Unfortunately, that's just not the way that things work, particularly in the city. So I'd say for situations where you're going to decide there's trade-off pros and cons. If you decide that you want to live in a building, you want the security that goes along with that, no one will fault you for that. If you decide to work with a private landlord, a person who just owns the house and decided to rent it out, meet that person. Go with your roommates, meet that person, get a feel for that person, interact with them. I mean, like I said, try to interview without interviewing and see if this is a person that you can actually work with, because it's a business relationship, yes, but it's a relationship before all else. So if this seems like a person who's communicative, engaged, compassionate, intelligent, whatever those characteristics are that you would need out of any type of relationship, make sure you see those. If you walk in and, the person's late, that's going to set a tone for you. And similarly, make sure that you're presenting a face that you want them to see as well, too, in terms of appearance, style, speech, conversation. And so do your best to engage with that person insofar as it's a landlord. I think it'll go a long way with the landlord, particularly in instances where it's a high desirable property. My properties are Class A properties, so I generally have a good pick. And I always go with the people who, came in, they met me on time, they shook hands, they looked you in the eyes, they asked honest questions, and they were just normal, well-adjusted people. Those are the people you want to do business with for the next 12 months. So on both sides, from a landlord and a tenant perspective, it's great to just get that face-to-face with the person you're going to be working with for the next 12 months and get a sense of comfort from them. Trust your instincts. If your instincts are telling you this person's kind of sketch, it's probably for the best, and maybe you look for another place.
You bring a very honest and a very compelling perspective coming from your side. I appreciate you being so open, sharing your initial story with us and into how you started in all of this, and sharing great insights of what students should expect and some things for them to consider as they're looking for their new apartment. Qadim, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your time and being on the Ditch Your Dorm podcast with Jove. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. I'd love to come back. I love to talk about this stuff. So if there's ever an opportunity in the future, please keep me in mind. I'd love to talk to you and your listeners again.
Will do. Thank you.